Hey guys, tonight we're leaving the comfy confines of your duvet cocoon and embarking on a journey to a place where history whispers secrets through dry stone walls. Imagine, for a moment, the vast, sun-baked plains of southern Africa, the air shimmering with heat, the only sounds the buzz of insects and the distant call of a bird of prey. Now picture rising from that flat landscape, a monumental city of granite, its walls soaring towards the impossibly blue sky, built entirely without mortar. It's a place that defied explanation for centuries, a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance. You're about to walk amongst giants, stone giants, and try to figure out their silent language. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive the sheer awe of it all, intact anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's cool to see how far these whispers travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of something ancient, something profound. The air here is thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and dry, ancient stone, a smell that gets right into your nose and makes you feel like you've stepped back through time. Before you, the landscape isn't just landscape anymore, it's punctuated by massive granite structures, rising organically from the ground as if they grew there over millennia. This is Great Zimbabwe, a name that echoes with power and mystery. You've seen pictures, maybe, but nothing prepares you for the sheer, silent presence of these ruins. They just are, unapologetically massive and utterly baffling when you first consider how they were put together. Imagine, if you will, walking into a place where the walls aren't held together by sticky stuff like cement or mud, but simply by the weight and precision of stones stacked upon stone. It's the ultimate game of Jenga, played with blocks weighing tons, on a scale that covers hundreds of acres. You can feel the history radiating from the stones, a warmth absorbed from centuries of sun, a coolness that speaks of deep time. The silence here isn't empty. It's full of the stories of the people who lived and worked and built this incredible city. For a long time, when outsiders first stumbled upon this place in the late 19th century, they simply couldn't fathom that it was built by the local African people. Their minds, unfortunately, were stuck in a colonial mindset that couldn't reconcile such sophistication with the societies they encountered. They conjured up tales of Phoenicians, Arabs, or even the Queen of Sheba, anyone but the ancestors of the people who still lived in the region. It's a classic case of, if I can't do it, surely you couldn't have done it either. Which is a frankly hilarious, if tragic, lack of imagination. But the truth, as it often does, eventually pushed its way through the layers of prejudice and fantasy. This city, this monumental achievement, was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, the predominant ethnic group in modern-day Zimbabwe. The sheer scale of the site is the first thing that really hits you. We're talking about a complex that covers about 1,800 acres, though the main stone structures are concentrated in a few key areas. It's not just one wall, it's a series of enclosures, terraces, and structures spread across a valley and up a steep, rocky hill. You stand there, craning your neck to look up at the towering walls of the great enclosure, and you think, okay, how? Seriously, how? These walls, some reaching over 30 feet high and 15 feet thick at the base, are built from millions of granite blocks, carefully selected and placed. There's no mortar, none. It looks impossible, like something a giant toddler built with very heavy, oddly shaped Lego bricks. The mystery of the construction is, of course, the main event, but Great Zimbabwe was far more than just a pile of impressive rocks. It was the capital of a powerful and prosperous kingdom that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. This wasn't just a defensive fort or a ceremonial site, though it had elements of both. It was a bustling city, a center of trade, administration, and religious life for tens of thousands of people living within its orbit. Imagine the sounds that would have filled this valley centuries ago: the chatter of voices, the clang of tools, the lowing of cattle, the rhythmic beat of drums. Now, only the wind whispers through the gaps in the stones, carrying ghosts of those ancient sounds. One mainstream historical fact that anchors this place is that at its peak, Great Zimbabwe was home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in sub-Saharan Africa during its time. That's a pretty substantial metropolis, especially considering the logistical challenges of feeding and housing that many people in one location back then. It wasn't just a village that got a bit enthusiastic with stone, it was a sophisticated urban center. A quirky tidbit? When early European explorers or treasure hunters, often one and the same, sadly, first saw the ruins, some were so convinced they couldn't have been built by Africans that they actually tried to undermine the walls looking for hidden treasures or evidence of their fantastical builders, causing significant damage in the process. Imagine being so wrong, you literally start dismantling history to prove your wrongness. It's almost admirable in its pigheadedness. Historians still argue whether the Great Enclosure, the most famous structure with its massive curved wall and iconic conical tower, was primarily a royal palace, a religious center, or perhaps a combination of both. Its exact function remains a subject of scholarly debate, adding another layer to the enigma. Was that conical tower just for show, or did it have a deeper symbolic or astronomical purpose? The stones aren't telling us, yet. As you begin to walk among these silent sentinels of stone, you start to notice the details. The way the stones fit together, not perfectly, but with a deliberate closeness. The sheer variety of shapes and sizes. The feeling that every single stone was chosen, lifted, and placed with intention. It's a feeling that builds stone by stone, just like the city itself. This wasn't random piling. This was skilled craftsmanship, a deep understanding of materials and structure, passed down through generations. And it all starts with the very ground beneath your feet, the source of the building blocks themselves. But before we delve into the quarrying and shaping, you need to understand the canvas they were working on, the land itself. You feel the subtle slope of the land under your feet as you walk away from the main visitor area towards the hill complex. This isn't a flat, featureless plain, it's a landscape defined by dramatic granite outcrops, known locally as koppies. These aren't just pretty hills, they are the geological heart of Great Zimbabwe, the source of the very material that defines the site. You can see them in the distance, rounded, massive domes of rock, looking like ancient giants sleeping under the African sun. The city is nestled amongst these koppies, using them as natural defenses and integrating them into the architectural plan. It's like the builders saw the raw potential of the landscape and decided to work with it, not against it, which is a level of ecological harmony we could honestly learn a lot from today. Imagine your local council trying to get planning permission for something this ambitious. They'd probably just flatten the koppie and build a roundabout. As you get closer to the hill complex, the first major structure you encounter, the sense of scale becomes overwhelming. The walls here aren't just standing, they seem to erupt from the granite bedrock, following the contours of the hill. It feels less like construction and more like the land itself decided to grow stone fortifications. You reach out and touch a stone, feeling the rough, weathered surface warm from the sun. These aren't small, manageable bricks. They are irregular shapes, some surprisingly large, fitted together with an astonishing degree of precision for having no mortar. You can run your fingers along the joins and see how tightly they sit against each other, relying purely on their weight and the skill of placement to maintain stability. The walls of the hill complex are particularly impressive because they incorporate natural boulders and cliff faces into the structure. It's a masterful blend of the natural and the built environment. You walk through narrow passages, squeezed between towering stone walls and smooth, natural rock faces. It feels almost organic, like exploring a cave system, but a cave system that someone decided needed really sturdy, man-made additions. The builders didn't just build on the hill. They built into it and around it, creating a complex warren of enclosures, platforms, and pathways. Then there's the Great Enclosure, located down in the valley. This is perhaps the most iconic image of Great Zimbabwe, an enormous, elliptical wall that seems to stretch on forever. Walking alongside this wall, you feel incredibly small. It's over 800 feet in circumference and, as we mentioned, reaches heights of over 30 feet. The sheer volume of stone used in just this one structure is staggering. Estimates vary, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, of individual stones. Imagine the logistics of this. No cranes, no trucks, just human hands and simple tools. Quarrying the stone, transporting it, shaping it, and then lifting it into place. It's a monumental undertaking that speaks volumes about the organized labor and resources available to the kingdom. It wasn't a weekend DIY project. This was a multi-generational endeavor, a true feat of engineering and human willpower. You stand there, feeling the weight of centuries in the silence, and the question just hangs in the air. How? How did they move these stones? How did they get them to fit so snugly? How did they build something so massive and enduring without a drop of mortar? The mystery of the mortarless construction is what really captures the imagination. It's called dry stone walling, a technique used in various parts of the world, but rarely on this scale and with this level of sophistication. It relies on the careful selection and placement of stones to create a stable, interlocking structure. Gravity and friction are your best friends here. The builders understood how to angle stones, how to use larger stones at the base for stability, and how to fill voids with smaller stones to create a solid mass. It's like a giant, incredibly complex jigsaw puzzle where every piece is heavy enough to crush you. One mainstream historical fact about the construction is that the total weight of the stone used across the entire Great Zimbabwe site is estimated to be around 1.5 million tons. That's roughly the weight of 15 modern aircraft carriers, just sitting there, dry stacked. Think about that for a second. Picking up 1.5 million tons with no heavy machinery. It boggles the mind, doesn't it? A quirky tidbit related to the walls involves the decorative patterns. Along the top of parts of the great enclosure wall, you can see a chevron pattern created by alternating the way the stones are laid. It's a beautiful, intricate detail that shows the builders weren't just focused on function. They also cared about aesthetics and symbolism. What did the chevron pattern represent? That's one of the things historians still argue, whether it was purely decorative, a symbol of royal power, a religious motif, or perhaps something else entirely. It adds another layer of enigma to these silent stones. You walk along the outer wall of the great enclosure, following its massive curve. The scale is relentless. Every few steps, you pass another section of this imposing barrier. It's built with a slight batter, meaning it slopes inward slightly as it rises, which adds to its stability, a simple but effective engineering trick. The top isn't perfectly level. It dips and rises, following the intended line. There are gaps, of course, worn by time and weather, and in some places, the wall has collapsed, leaving a tumble of heavy stones. But the vast majority still stands, a testament to the quality of the original construction. The sheer effort involved is almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective, where building is often about speed and standardization. This was slow, painstaking work, requiring immense skill, patience, and coordination. It wasn't just about stacking rocks. It was about understanding the properties of each individual stone and finding its perfect place within the larger structure. It's the ultimate example of craftsmanship on an industrial scale, but powered by human muscle and ingenuity. As you continue your walk, you notice the different styles of walling in different areas of the site. Some are massive and imposing, like the great enclosure and the hill complex. Others are lower, forming terraces or dividing smaller enclosures. But the underlying principle remains the same: dry stone construction, relying on weight and fit. It's a consistent language spoken across the entire city, a language of stone and gravity. The mystery of how they did it is intertwined with the mystery of who they were, the people capable of conceiving and executing such a monumental vision. And that brings us to the builders themselves, the ancestors of the Shona people, whose story is etched into these stones. The ancestors of the Shona people, whose story is etched into these stones. For centuries, their connection to this place was denied, obscured by a fog of prejudice and willful ignorance. Imagine, if you will, the sheer frustration of the local people, the descendants of the builders, watching outsiders arrive, look at these walls, and declare, "Impossible! You couldn't have done this!" It's like someone admiring your magnificent cake and insisting it must have been baked by a passing alien because, clearly, you couldn't possibly possess such baking prowess. Utterly ridiculous, and yet, that was the prevailing mindset for too long. The truth, supported by decades of archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and linguistic analysis, points directly to the ancestors of the Shona people as the architects and inhabitants of Great Zimbabwe. These weren't some mysterious foreigners who vanished into the mists of time. They were the people who lived on this land, who understood its rhythms, and who developed the skills necessary to harness its resources. Their story isn't separate from the stones. It's woven into every joint, every curve, every towering section of wall. So, who were these ancestors? They were part of the Bantu migrations, a vast movement of people across Africa over thousands of years. The groups who would eventually coalesce into the Shona identity began settling in this region, the high veld of what is now Zimbabwe, perhaps as early as the 4th century CE. They brought with them agricultural skills, ironworking technology, and sophisticated social structures. Over the centuries, different groups arrived, interacted, and eventually developed distinct cultural identities, including the ancestors of the modern Shona. Think about that slow, steady movement of people across a continent, bringing knowledge and traditions with them. It wasn't a sudden invasion, it was a gradual process of settlement, adaptation, and growth. These early communities were primarily agriculturalists, cultivating crops like sorghum and millet, and raising cattle. They lived in smaller, scattered villages, often nestled amongst the same granite copies that would later become the building blocks and backdrops for the great city. You can almost hear the gentle rustle of the dry grass in the wind, picturing small homesteads with thatched roofs, the smell of wood smoke hanging in the air. As these communities grew and interacted, they developed more complex political and social systems. Leaders emerged capable of organizing labor, resolving disputes, and coordinating trade. This gradual increase in social complexity was absolutely crucial for the eventual construction of Great Zimbabwe. Building something of this scale requires centralized authority, the ability to mobilize large numbers of people for non-agricultural tasks like quarrying and construction, and the resources to feed and house them while they work. It wasn't just about having the technical skill, it was about having the societal structure to support such a massive undertaking. The colonial myths, sadly, were persistent and deeply damaging. When figures like the notorious treasure hunter Karl Marx arrived in the late 1800s and saw the ruins, he simply refused to believe they were built by Africans. He attributed them to the Queen of Sheba or Phoenicians, literally inventing fantastical origins rather than accept the evidence right in front of him, the presence of the local Karana people, a Shona subgroup, who had oral traditions linking them to the site. It's a sad, but perhaps unsurprising, demonstration of how prejudice can blind people to obvious truths. Imagine finding a magnificent, ancient building and deciding the people who live right next to it, who have stories about it, couldn't possibly be connected. It boggles the modern mind, truly. One mainstream historical fact that directly contradicts these myths is the wealth of archaeological evidence found at Great Zimbabwe. Excavations have unearthed pottery, tools, and other artifacts that are clearly linked to the ancestors of the Shona people and show a continuous cultural development in the region. You find the same types of pottery in earlier, smaller settlements as you do within the city walls, demonstrating a clear cultural lineage. There's no sudden appearance of foreign artifacts that would suggest a different builder population. A quirky tidbit related to this is the famous Zimbabwe birds, carved soapstone figures found within the ruins, which have become a national symbol of Zimbabwe. While their exact meaning is debated, they are stylistically unique to this region and period, and clearly link the site to the artistic and religious practices of the people who lived there, not some far-flung civilization. These birds, perched silently on pedestals or walls, feel like guardians, silent witnesses to the history that unfolded here. Historians still argue whether the rise of Great Zimbabwe was primarily driven by the development of long-distance trade networks, particularly in gold and ivory, or by internal political and social changes within the Shona society. It was likely a combination of factors, with increasing wealth from trade providing the resources and the evolving social structure providing the organization needed to build and maintain such a large capital. But the debate about which factor was the primary catalyst adds another layer to understanding the kingdom's origins. As you walk through the ruins, you can almost feel the presence of these ancestors. They weren't just builders, they were farmers, herders, craftspeople, traders, priests, and rulers. They lived complex lives within these walls, under the shadow of the towering stones they had so painstakingly placed. Their world was one intricately connected to the land, to the movement of the seasons, and to the flow of goods along ancient trade routes. They built this city not just as a dwelling place, but as a statement of power, prosperity, and cultural identity. It was the heart of their kingdom, a place that reflected their achievements and aspirations. Understanding that the Shona ancestors built Great Zimbabwe isn't just about correcting a historical inaccuracy. It's about acknowledging the incredible ingenuity, skill, and organization of African societies long before colonial contact. It reframes the narrative from one of mysterious, inexplicable ruins to one of a powerful, sophisticated kingdom that flourished through the efforts of its own people, using the resources and knowledge available to them. It makes the stones speak not just of construction techniques, but of a vibrant, dynamic culture that shaped its environment on a truly monumental scale. And this shaping, this transformation from smaller settlements to a grand stone city, didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, organic process, like a seed gradually pushing its way through the soil and growing into something vast and complex. Imagine, for a moment, the landscape before the towering walls of Great Zimbabwe existed. You'd see scattered villages, clusters of circular huts with thatched roofs, surrounded by fields of millet and sorghum, and kraals, enclosures for cattle. These were the building blocks, the foundational communities from which the great city would eventually emerge. These early settlements, dating back centuries before Great Zimbabwe's peak, were built primarily from readily available materials: wood for frames, reeds and thatch for roofs, and earth or mud for walls. They were perfectly functional homes, well suited to the climate and the lifestyle of agriculturalists and cattle herders. People lived in extended family groups, working the land, raising livestock, and engaging in local trade. Life was centered around the rhythms of the seasons, the needs of the crops, and the health of the herds. You can almost smell the wood smoke from their cooking fires drifting across the valley in the cool evenings. As these communities grew, they became more complex. Population increased, leading to the need for more organized ways of managing resources like land and water. Leaders, often powerful cattle owners or skilled arbitrators, began to consolidate influence over wider areas. This wasn't just about individual villages anymore. It was about the emergence of larger chiefdoms or polities, capable of coordinating activities across several settlements. Think of it like a bunch of small startups deciding to merge and form a slightly bigger, slightly more organized company. It requires a different level of management, different structures. The control of cattle was particularly important. In many African societies, cattle were not just livestock. They were a form of wealth, a measure of status, and a means of exchange. A leader who controlled large herds could distribute wealth, gain loyalty, and attract followers. This accumulation of wealth and power provided the basis for larger-scale organization and the mobilization of labor beyond the immediate needs of farming. You can almost hear the lowing of thousands of cattle, a sound that would have signified prosperity and influence. Another key factor was the development of trade networks. The region around Great Zimbabwe was rich in resources, particularly gold. As early as the 10th or 11th century, communities in this area were extracting gold and trading it, along with ivory and other goods, with Swahili merchants on the East African coast. These merchants were connected to wider Indian Ocean trade routes, linking southern Africa to Arabia, India, and even beyond. This long-distance trade brought new forms of wealth into the region, goods like glass beads, ceramics, and cloth, which further enhanced the power and prestige of the ruling elite. Imagine trading a chunk of gold for a string of beautiful, colorful beads from a far-off land. It wasn't just commerce, it was a connection to a wider, exciting world. This growing wealth and increasing social complexity fueled the transition in building practices. While earlier stone structures existed, they were generally smaller and less elaborate. As the central authority grew stronger and wealthier, they could afford to invest in more permanent and impressive structures. Stone, abundant in the surrounding kopjes, was the obvious choice. It was durable, readily available, and building with it on a large scale was a powerful statement of permanence and authority. Why build a chief's residence out of mud and thatch when you could build it out of solid rock, a structure that would last for generations and project power? The location where Great Zimbabwe stands today likely became important because it offered a combination of advantages: proximity to stone resources, defensible hilltops, fertile valleys for agriculture, and a central position within the growing kingdom and trade networks. It wasn't necessarily the only important center, but it gradually became the most dominant, attracting people, wealth, and power. The transition from scattered villages to a centralized urban center was driven by this concentration of political, economic, and perhaps religious authority in one prime location. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of gradual development. Excavations show earlier layers of occupation with less substantial structures beneath the massive stone walls. You can see the progression, the slow accumulation of building knowledge and organizational capacity. It wasn't like they woke up one morning and decided to build a skyscraper. It was more like they started with a sturdy shed, then built a slightly bigger barn, and eventually decided to construct an entire stone castle. One mainstream historical fact about this transition is that the peak period of stone building at Great Zimbabwe, including the construction of the Great Enclosure and the major walls on the hill complex, occurred primarily between the 13th and 15th centuries CE. This came after centuries of prior settlement and the gradual development of the kingdom's wealth and power, showing it was the culmination of a long process, not a sudden event. A quirky tidbit related to this transition is that early stone structures might have been used primarily for cattle enclosures or grain storage before the techniques were scaled up for residential or ceremonial buildings. Imagine practicing your dry stone skills on a cow pen before tackling a 30-foot wall. Makes a certain kind of practical sense, doesn't it? It suggests a learning curve, a gradual mastery of the craft. Historians still argue whether the shift to large-scale stone building at Great Zimbabwe was primarily a result of the increasing wealth generated by the gold trade, which provided the surplus resources needed to fund such massive projects, or whether it was driven more by internal political dynamics, such as rulers' consolidate ing power and using monumental architecture to legitimize their authority and impress their subjects and rivals. It was likely a complex interplay of both factors, but the exact weighting remains a subject of debate. So, the city didn't just appear out of nowhere. It grew, slowly and deliberately, from the roots of smaller agricultural communities. It was the product of increasing population, evolving social structures, growing wealth from trade, and the gradual development of the skills needed to harness the abundant stone of the landscape. It was a transformation from scattered villages to a powerful, centralized urban center, a place that needed a strategic location to thrive. And that brings us to why this specific spot, nestled amongst these particular copies, was chosen as the heart of this burgeoning kingdom. And that brings us to why this specific spot, nestled amongst these particular copies, was chosen as the heart of this burgeoning kingdom. You stand here, looking out over the landscape, and you start to see it not just as a beautiful view, but as a deliberate, strategic choice. It's not just a picturesque valley with some handy hills, it's a location that offered a perfect storm of advantages for a growing power. First, there's the sheer defensibility of the site. The hill complex, perched atop that steep granite kopje, is a natural fortress. Building walls and enclosures up there, integrating them with the existing rock formations, created a highly secure area. Anyone approaching the city, especially from the north or west, would have been visible from miles away. Imagine trying to sneak up on a place where the rulers are living in a fortified complex on top of a massive, rocky hill, with stone walls following every contour. It would be like trying to surprise a squirrel in a watchtower. Not easy. The valley floor structures, while impressive, were also overlooked and protected by the hill complex above. It's a classic high ground advantage, baked right into the geography. Then there are the resources. We've already talked about the granite, the very bones of the city, available in seemingly endless supply from the surrounding kopjes. But it wasn't just stone. The valleys around Great Zimbabwe, particularly the fertile alluvial plains of the Mutarikwi River basin, were ideal for agriculture. A large urban population needs a reliable food supply, and the ability to grow staple crops like millet and sorghum nearby was essential. You can almost picture the patchwork of fields stretching out from the city walls, providing sustenance for thousands. Water was also a critical factor. While the main ruins aren't directly on a major river, the Mutarikwi River is relatively close, providing a source of water for drinking, agriculture, and potentially livestock. In a semi-arid region, access to reliable water is paramount for sustaining a large settlement. They weren't building on a desert, thankfully, but choosing a spot with decent water access was a no-brainer for long-term survival and growth. Beyond the immediate needs of defense, building materials, food, and water, the location of Great Zimbabwe was also incredibly strategic from a regional perspective. It was situated on the southern edge of the Highveld, controlling access to the lower-lying areas to the south and east. More importantly, it was positioned to control key trade routes. Remember how we talked about gold and ivory being traded to the East African coast? Great Zimbabwe was right in the sweet spot, acting as a major hub. It was close enough to the gold-producing regions further west and south to control that valuable resource, and it was well placed to facilitate the movement of goods towards the Indian Ocean coast. Think of it like being located at a major intersection on a national highway, back before highways existed. Everyone heading in certain directions, especially with valuable cargo, had to pass through or near your territory. This allowed the rulers of Great Zimbabwe to control and tax this trade, accumulating immense wealth. This wealth, in turn, could be used to maintain the kingdom, support the population, and crucially, fund the massive building projects that defined the city. It's a classic case of geography equals destiny, or at least, geography equals opportunity. The combination of these factors, defensibility, abundant building materials, fertile land, water access, and strategic position on trade routes, made this spot uniquely suited to become the capital of a powerful kingdom. It wasn't just one thing. It was the synergy of multiple advantages that allowed Great Zimbabwe to grow from a collection of smaller settlements into a major urban and political center. It's a testament to the strategic thinking of its builders, who clearly understood the lay of the land and its potential. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the importance of its location is that Great Zimbabwe effectively controlled the flow of gold from the interior mines to the Swahili coast for centuries. This control was a primary source of its power and wealth, directly linked to its strategic position. A quirky tidbit related to the location involves the acoustics. Within some of the enclosures, particularly in the hill complex, the way the walls are built and the natural rock formations interact can create surprising acoustic effects, amplifying sounds or creating echoes. While perhaps not a primary reason for choosing the site, it's a fascinating consequence of building within and around the specific geography, maybe even used intentionally for communication or ceremonial purposes. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the location's importance was its natural defensibility, which allowed the ruling elite to protect themselves and their wealth, or its central position on the burgeoning trade networks, which facilitated the accumulation of that wealth in the first place. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. Did they get rich because they were defensible, or did they become powerful enough to build a defensible city because they were rich from trade? Standing here, feeling the scale of the structures and looking out at the surrounding landscape, you gain a deeper appreciation for the choices made by the Shona ancestors. They didn't just pick a random spot. They chose a location that provided the resources, security, and connectivity necessary for their kingdom to thrive. It was a decision that shaped not just the city, but the history of the entire region. They saw the potential in the granite copies, the fertile valleys, and the pathways connecting them to the wider world. And seeing that potential led them to the next crucial step, getting the stone out of the ground. You look around again at the massive granite domes, the copies that surround the site like sleeping giants. These aren't just geological features. They were the quarries, the raw material depots for the entire city. Imagine standing at the base of one of these colossal rocks, knowing that the very walls you're about to build, the ones that will stand for centuries, have to come from here. It's a daunting thought. The granite here isn't just a solid, impenetrable mass. Over millennia, geological forces and weathering have caused it to fracture and split along natural fault lines, creating large, often somewhat rectangular or polygonal blocks. This is key. The Shona ancestors weren't carving perfect cubes out of solid rock like ancient Egyptians with limestone. They were harvesting blocks that nature had already started to prepare for them. Think of it like finding pre-scored chocolate bars in the ground. Only instead of chocolate, it's rock, and instead of bite-sized pieces, they weigh as much as a small car. So, the first step was locating these naturally fractured areas, often on the flanks or at the base of the copies. You can still see evidence of these ancient quarry sites today, scars on the landscape where the stone was removed. Once a suitable block was identified, the work began. This wasn't a quiet process. Imagine the sounds echoing through the valley, the clang of metal tools against stone, the grunts and shouts of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of workers, the rhythmic chipping and hammering. While they didn't have explosives or heavy machinery, they had ingenuity and muscle power. They likely exploited existing cracks by driving in wooden wedges, which were then possibly soaked with water. As the wood expanded, it would exert immense pressure, widening the crack and eventually splitting the rock. You can almost hear the sharp crack as a massive piece finally breaks free from the bedrock. It's a slow, laborious process, requiring patience and a deep understanding of the stone's properties. They weren't just hitting rocks randomly. They were working with the grain, with the natural weaknesses of the granite. Once a block was detached, the next challenge was moving it. Remember how we talked about the total weight of stone being around 1.5 million tons? That stone didn't just teleport itself to the building site. This is where the organization and scale of the Great Zimbabwe kingdom really become apparent. Moving blocks that could weigh hundreds of pounds, or even several tons, would have required significant manpower and simple, yet effective, technology. We're talking ropes made from plant fibers, wooden rollers, levers, and maybe even temporary ramps built from earth and smaller stones. Imagine teams of workers, straining and coordinating their efforts, slowly inching a massive granite block down a hillside or across the valley floor. It would have been incredibly demanding work, requiring strength, endurance, and precise teamwork. There would have been supervisors directing the effort, ensuring everyone pulled together, quite literally. It wasn't just about individual strength. It was about the collective power of an organized society focused on a common goal. It makes your last trip to the gym seem like a gentle stroll in the park, doesn't it? Once the stones reached the building site, they weren't typically subjected to extensive fine shaping. The beauty and stability of Great Zimbabwe's walls come from the careful selection and placement of stones that were already roughly the right size and shape, and then fitting them together like a giant, irregular puzzle. However, some preparation was necessary. Sharp edges might be blunted, and rough surfaces might be smoothed slightly using smaller stones or simple tools. This wasn't about creating perfectly uniform blocks, but about making the existing blocks work together effectively. Think of it as tailoring a suit using pre-cut pieces of fabric rather than weaving the fabric from scratch and then cutting it. They likely had skilled stone workers who could assess a block and determine where it might fit best in a wall, or how it could be slightly adjusted to improve the fit. This required an eye for form, a practical understanding of physics, and a lot of trial and error passed down through generations. The stones weren't just dumped on site. They were managed, sorted, and prepared for their final resting place in the wall. One mainstream historical fact about the quarrying process is that archaeologists have found evidence of numerous quarry sites in the kopjes surrounding Great Zimbabwe, some located within a few kilometers of the main building areas, confirming that the stone was sourced locally from these granite outcrops. A quirky tidbit is that the Shona ancestors may have used fire and then rapidly cooled the rock with water, thermal shock, to help fracture the granite blocks along natural lines of weakness, a technique known to have been used in other ancient quarrying operations around the world. Imagine the steam rising from the hot rock as they doused it, a dramatic, almost mystical part of the process. Historians still argue whether the primary method for shaping the stones involved significant intentional dressing and trimming with tools, or if it was primarily a process of selecting naturally suitable blocks and then using minimal modification to fit them together, relying mostly on skilled placement. The debate centers on the extent to which the irregular shapes are natural versus deliberately created or refined. So, the process began in the heart of the granite hills, identifying fractures, leveraging massive blocks free using simple tools and ingenuity, and then undertaking the monumental task of transporting these heavy stones to the building sites. It was a process that required immense effort, sophisticated organization, and a deep connection to the raw materials provided by the landscape. The stones were ready, or ready enough, for their journey from the earth to the sky, destined to become the strong base of a city that would defy time. And seeing that potential led them to the next crucial step, getting the stone out of the ground. The raw material, wrested from the stubborn grip of the copy, now sits at the edge of the building's site. These aren't uniform bricks arriving on a pallet, they are irregular, heavy chunks of granite, varying wildly in size and shape. Some are relatively flat and blocky, thanks to the natural fractures we talked about, while others are more rounded or angular. The builders of Great Zimbabwe didn't simply stack whatever they found, they had a sophisticated process of selection and preparation, one that allowed them to build these monumental walls without a single drop of mortar. Imagine the scene, piles of freshly quarried stone, glinting in the sun. The air is thick with dust, the faint smell of damp earth and crushed rock. Teams of workers are moving amongst the piles, not just idly, but with purpose. They are assessing each stone, turning it over, looking at its facets, its weight, its potential. This is where the skill really comes into play, the deep, intuitive knowledge of the material passed down through generations. They weren't just laborers, they were stone whisperers, understanding how each piece might behave and where it might belong in the grand puzzle. The primary method wasn't about carving these irregular blocks into perfect rectangles. That would have been an almost impossible task on this scale with the tools they had. Instead, it was about finding stones that already had suitable shapes and sizes, and then making minimal adjustments. Think of it less like sculpting and more like tailoring, but instead of fabric, you're working with granite. They would look for stones with relatively flat surfaces that could sit securely on another stone, or with edges that could interlock with adjacent pieces. Simple tools were undoubtedly used for this fine-tuning. Stone hammers, perhaps, made from harder, denser rock, or chisels and points made from iron, though evidence of extensive metal tool use for shaping the granite itself is less common than for quarrying or other tasks. More likely, much of the shaping involved using other stones to chip away small protrusions, blunt sharp corners that might prevent a good fit, or generally tidy up the edges. It was a process of refinement, not transformation. They coaxed the stones into cooperation, rather than forcing them into submission. It's like trying to fit oddly shaped puzzle pieces together by slightly filing down a bump here or there, rather than trying to cut completely new pieces. The goal wasn't a perfectly smooth, seamless wall like you'd get with modern cut stone and mortar. Look closely at the walls of Great Zimbabwe, and you'll see the surfaces are rough, the joints are visible, but the stones fit together with remarkable tightness and stability. This snug fit is achieved by carefully selecting stones that complement each other's shapes and by placing them with incredible precision. It requires an understanding of load bearing, weight distribution, and friction. Imagine a skilled builder picking up a stone, turning it this way and that, perhaps testing it against a spot in the wall that needs filling. They visualize how it will sit, how its weight will bear down, how its edges will interact with the stones around it. It's a three-dimensional puzzle played out in real time, with consequences measured in tons of rock. They might try a stone, find it doesn't quite sit right, and swap it for another from the carefully curated piles. This wasn't random stacking, it was deliberate, informed construction. This method of selecting and minimally preparing stones, relying on natural shapes and skilled placement, is a key aspect of dry stone walling. It allows for strong, durable structures to be built relatively efficiently compared to methods requiring extensive stone dressing. And it's why the walls have that distinctive, organic look, as if they grew from the earth, made of stones that still largely retain their natural forms. One mainstream historical fact about the stone preparation is that analyses of the stone surfaces at Great Zimbabwe show relatively little evidence of extensive, systematic tool marks indicative of widespread fine dressing or carving. This supports the theory that the builders primarily selected naturally suitable blocks and used minimal modification, relying on careful fitting rather than precise shaping. A quirky tidbit? Some of the smaller stones used to fill gaps or provide stability within the core of the walls, known as packing stones, might have been brought from slightly further afield or were the waste products from the limited shaping that did occur. It shows they utilized resources efficiently, even using the offcuts to improve the structure's integrity. It's the ancient equivalent of recycling your building waste, which is frankly pretty cool. Historians still argue whether the degree of intentional shaping and dressing of stones varied significantly between different periods of construction at Great Zimbabwe or between different areas of the site, e.g., the hill complex versus the Great Enclosure. Some scholars suggest earlier phases might have involved more rudimentary fitting, while later phases show increased refinement in selection and minimal preparation techniques. So, the stones weren't hammered into submission or carved into perfect forms. They were chosen, assessed, perhaps slightly persuaded with a few chips or knocks, and then placed with incredible skill. It was a process that respected the natural properties of the granite while transforming it into something entirely new and monumental. It was about finding the right piece for the right spot, one stone at a time, building not just walls, but stability and permanence, starting with the very base of the structure, transforming it into something entirely new and monumental. It was about finding the right piece for the right spot, one stone at a time, building not just walls, but stability and permanence, starting with the very base of the structure. Now, imagine you've got these carefully selected, minimally prepared stones ready to go. Where do you put the very first one? The answer, of course, is the foundation. Building a massive stone wall that stands 30 feet high without mortar is impressive enough, but doing it on ground that isn't perfectly flat? That's a whole other level of genius. You walk across the site, especially up towards the hill complex, and you can feel the unevenness of the terrain. It's not a billiard table, it's a landscape of slopes, bumps, and exposed bedrock. The builders of Great Zimbabwe understood that the strength of any structure begins at its feet, or rather, its base. For dry stone walls, this is doubly true. Without mortar to bind the stones together and distribute weight evenly, the structure relies entirely on gravity, friction, and the careful interlocking of the stones themselves. If the base isn't stable, the whole thing is doomed to wobble, shift, and eventually collapse. It's like trying to stack a precarious tower of biscuits on a wobbly plate. It's not going to end well, no matter how carefully you stack the biscuits. So, what did they do? For areas on relatively flat ground, like the valley floor where the Great Enclosure sits, they likely prepared the ground by clearing vegetation and perhaps leveling a shallow trench for the first course of stones. This would provide a consistent surface to start from. But on the slopes of the kopjes, or where natural bedrock outcrops rose from the ground, they had to be much more creative. They didn't try to flatten the entire hillside. That would have been an impossible amount of work. Instead, they worked with the landscape. You can see evidence of this everywhere in the hill complex. The foundations follow the contours of the bedrock, stepping up or down to accommodate the natural slope. Where there was a large, immovable boulder, they simply incorporated it into the base of the wall, using it as a natural anchor point. It's a brilliant example of adapting construction to the environment, rather than forcing the environment to fit the construction. Imagine trying to explain this to a modern builder obsessed with perfectly flat concrete slabs. They'd probably have a mild panic attack. The first course, or the bottom layer of stones, was absolutely critical. These were typically the largest and heaviest stones available. Think of them as the anchors, the bedrock on which everything else would rest. By placing the biggest stones at the base, they created a wide, stable footing and distributed the immense weight of the wall over a larger area. This principle is still fundamental to engineering today. A wider base equals more stability for a tall structure. You see it in everything from skyscrapers to ancient pyramids. Laying this first course required immense skill and precision. Each stone had to be carefully seated, ensuring it was stable and wouldn't rock or shift. They would select stones with flat bottoms or create a relatively flat bearing surface to sit on the ground or the stone below it. On slopes, the stones in the first course would be laid so they were level horizontally, even if the overall course stepped up the hill. This ensured that the subsequent layers would be built on a stable, level plane, preventing the wall from leaning or collapsing downhill. It's like building stairs out of giant rocks, but the stairs are also the foundation for a wall. The sheer weight of the stones in the lower courses is what provides much of the stability for a dry stone wall. Gravity, usually the enemy of tall structures, becomes your best friend. The weight of the upper layers presses down on the lower layers, locking the stones together through friction and compression. The wider the base, the more weight it can handle, and the taller the wall can be before it becomes unstable. The walls of the great enclosure, reaching over 30 feet high, are up to 15 feet thick at the base. That massive width isn't just for show, it's essential for stability, providing a huge footprint to support the towering structure above. While the main walls are dry stone, some archaeologists have found evidence suggesting that in certain areas, particularly the very lowest courses or where the walls meet the bedrock, the builders might have used a small amount of clay or earth infill. This wasn't mortar in the binding sense, but perhaps used to help level the initial course or fill small voids in the irregular bedrock surface, providing a slightly more even platform for the first layer of heavy stones. It's a subtle detail, but one that shows their practical approach to problem solving. Building these foundations was a process of patient, skilled labor. It wasn't just about moving heavy rocks. It was about understanding how those rocks would interact with the ground and with each other under immense pressure. It required experienced builders who could read the landscape, select the right stones, and place them with an eye towards long-term stability. They were laying the groundwork, quite literally, for centuries of existence. One mainstream historical fact about the foundations is that the walls, especially the larger ones like the Great Enclosure, are characterized by a battered profile, meaning they slope inwards slightly from the base upwards. This intentional lean increases the wall's stability by shifting the center of gravity inwards, a sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics applied to dry stone building. A quirky tidbit about the base involves the way some walls seamlessly merge with natural rock formations in the hill complex. It can sometimes be genuinely difficult to tell where the natural copy ends and the man-made wall begins, as the builders fitted stones so perfectly against the existing rock, almost as if the wall is growing organically from the hill itself. It's like the ultimate camouflage, but for architecture. Historians still argue whether the practice of using larger stones at the base and progressively smaller stones higher up the wall was a universally applied, deliberate principle across all construction phases at Great Zimbabwe, or if it was a more general tendency influenced by practicality and the availability of stones at different stages of building. So, before a single towering course could be laid, before the iconic chevron patterns could be contemplated, the builders had to grapple with the fundamental challenge of gravity and uneven ground. They selected the heaviest stones, prepared the ground as best they could, and laid that crucial first layer with meticulous care, creating a strong, stable base that has allowed these incredible structures to stand for centuries, defying the elements and gravity itself, all without the sticky embrace of mortar. With the foundation set, the real magic of dry stone could begin. The technique that defines Great Zimbabwe and makes it such an enduring enigma. You stand before a section of wall, perhaps one of the less towering ones initially, and you try to deconstruct it in your mind. No cement, no sticky mud, nothing to hold the stones together but the stones themselves. It seems utterly counterintuitive in a world built on mortar and fasteners. How do you make heavy, irregular rocks stand tall and proud for centuries using nothing but gravity and physics? This core method is known as dry stone walling, a technique used in various forms around the globe, but perfected and applied on a scale rarely seen elsewhere by the builders of Great Zimbabwe. It's an art form, a science, and a monumental feat of practical engineering all rolled into one. The fundamental principle is deceptively simple: stack stones in such a way that their weight locks them together. But achieving this simplicity on a grand scale, with irregular blocks, is anything but easy. Imagine the builders, having laid that crucial, heavy first course we just talked about. Now, they start adding the second layer, then the third, and so on. Each stone isn't just dropped into place, It's carefully selected from the prepared piles, assessed for its shape and size, and then fitted snugly against the stones below and beside it. Think of it as building a giant, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where every piece is unique and weighs a ton. You have to find the piece that fits just right, ensuring there are no large gaps and that the stone sits firmly without rocking. The stability comes from several factors. Firstly, the sheer mass of the stones. Gravity is your friend here. The weight of the upper layers pushes down on the lower layers, creating compression and friction between the stone's surfaces. This pressure helps to lock the stones in place, preventing them from shifting horizontally. It's like squeezing a bunch of marbles together in your hand. The tighter you squeeze, the less they can move relative to each other. Secondly, the careful interlocking of the stones. The builders weren't just stacking stones directly on top of each other like building blocks. They were overlapping them, ensuring that the joint between two stones in one layer was spanned by a single stone in the layer above. This technique, known as bonding or lapping, ties the wall together horizontally and vertically, distributing the load and preventing the wall from splitting or bulging outwards. It creates a cohesive structure, even without a bonding agent. Imagine building a brick wall, but without the mortar. If you just stacked bricks straight up, it would fall over instantly. You have to stagger the joints, right? Same principle, just with much bigger, heavier, and less uniform pieces. Thirdly, the internal structure. While the visible outer faces of the walls are made of carefully selected and fitted stones, the interior of the thicker walls is often filled with smaller stones, rubble, and earth. This infill adds mass and helps to consolidate the wall, preventing the outer faces from collapsing inwards. It acts like a solid core, providing internal support and stability. It's not just a hollow shell, it's a dense, heavy structure all the way through. You can sometimes see this infill exposed where a section of wall has collapsed, revealing the less organized material within the meticulously constructed outer layers. The skill of the builders lay in their ability to select and place stones to maximize these principles: weight, interlocking, and internal cohesion. They had to be able to look at an irregular stone and know where it would fit best in the wall, how its shape would interact with its neighbors, and how it would contribute to the overall stability of the structure. It required an incredible spatial awareness, a deep understanding of physics, even if they didn't call it that, and years of practical experience. It's the kind of skill that can't be learned from a textbook. It's honed through practice, observation, and tradition. Think about the rhythm of the work. A stone is chosen, lifted by manpower, remember, maybe with levers and ropes, carried to the wall, and then carefully maneuvered into position. The builder might try it one way, then another, perhaps rotating it or flipping it until it settles into a stable position, fitting snugly against the surrounding stones. There might be adjustments needed, a slight chip removed here or there, or perhaps a smaller stone used as a wedge to ensure a tight fit. It's a dance between the builder and the stone, a negotiation to find the perfect resting place. This wasn't just about stacking rocks. It was about creating a structure that could withstand the test of time, the force of gravity, and the occasional buffet of wind or rain. The slight batter, inward slope, of the walls we mentioned earlier is another example of this sophisticated understanding of stability. It shifts the center of gravity, making the wall inherently more resistant to toppling outwards. It's a subtle detail, but one that speaks volumes about the builder's mastery of their craft. The dry stone technique also offered practical advantages. It didn't require the preparation or transportation of mortar, which would have been a significant logistical challenge on this scale. It also allowed for some flexibility in the structure, as dry stone walls can settle and shift slightly over time without necessarily collapsing, unlike rigid structures held together by mortar. It's a resilient form of construction, able to adapt to minor ground movements or settling. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the mastery of this technique is that the major dry stone walls at Great Zimbabwe have stood for over 600 years, enduring seismic activity, weathering, and human interference, a testament to the inherent stability and durability of this construction method when executed correctly on a massive scale. A quirky tidbit is that the irregular shape of the granite blocks, far from being a hindrance, may have actually contributed to the stability of the dry stone walls. The uneven surfaces and angles create more points of contact and friction between adjacent stones than perfectly smooth, uniform blocks would, enhancing the interlocking effect and resistance to slippage. It's like having extra grip on your building blocks. Historians still argue whether the specific style and precision of dry stone construction seen at Great Zimbabwe represent a unique, local innovation developed solely within the Shona kingdom, or if it was a highly refined adaptation of dry stone techniques practiced more widely in southern Africa, influenced perhaps by earlier traditions or contact with other building styles. So, the magic of Great Zimbabwe's construction lies not in a secret binding agent, but in the profound understanding of stone, gravity, and structure possessed by its builders. They took the raw, irregular gifts of the copies and transformed them into enduring monuments through patience, skill, and collective effort. Each stone, selected and placed with intention, contributes to the strength and stability of the whole, creating walls that rise towards the sky, silent witnesses to the mastery of dry stone. And as these walls grew, they began to take on distinct forms and functions across the vast site. Silent witnesses to the mastery of dry stone. And as these walls grew, they began to take on distinct forms and functions across the vast site, shaping the very geography of the city. You walk among them now, and you see that Great Zimbabwe isn't just defined by a wall, but by a symphony of walls, each with its own character and purpose, all built using that same fundamental, mortarless technique. There are the truly monumental walls, the ones that immediately grab your attention and make your jaw drop. These are the towering outer walls of the great enclosure down in the valley and the formidable fortifications of the hill complex. These aren't just property boundaries. They are statements of power, security, and architectural ambition. The great enclosure wall, as we've mentioned, is a massive, graceful curve, enclosing a vast elliptical space. Walking alongside it, you feel enclosed, protected, and simultaneously dwarfed by its scale. It creates a distinct, separate world within its embrace. The walls here are incredibly thick, especially at the base, reinforcing their role as a primary defensive or symbolic barrier. They rise smoothly, or as smoothly as dry stone can be, towards the sky, culminating in some areas with intricate decorative patterns. Up on the hill complex, the walls are different again. They are less uniform, more integrated with the natural granite boulders and cliffs. They follow the undulating terrain, creating a complex series of interconnected enclosures, narrow passages, and elevated platforms. These walls feel more organic, almost like extensions of the rock itself. They serve obvious defensive purposes, turning the already difficult-to-access hilltop into a near-impenetrable stronghold. But they also create distinct internal spaces, suggesting different functions, perhaps royal residences, ceremonial areas, or lookouts. The sheer effort required to build on such steep, rocky terrain is mind-boggling. It's like someone looked at a mountain and thought, "You know what this needs? More walls." Beyond these massive structures, you find a network of smaller walls and enclosures scattered across the valley floor and lower slopes. These walls are typically lower and thinner than the main ones, but they are still built with the same dry stone technique. They served various purposes, dividing residential areas, creating livestock kraals, enclosures, forming terraces for agriculture or building platforms on sloping ground, and defining pathways and public spaces. Imagine walking through a neighborhood where all the fences and garden walls are made of perfectly fitted dry stone. It would be incredibly impressive, and probably very annoying if your ball went over the fence. These smaller walls are just as important to understanding the city as the large ones. They show that the dry stone technique wasn't reserved only for grand, monumental projects. It was the standard building method, applied to the everyday infrastructure of the city. It speaks to the widespread skill and the cultural preference for this durable, locally sourced material. You can see how different areas were demarcated, how spaces were organized, and how the city was laid out through this network of stone boundaries. The function of these various walls and enclosures is a key part of the mystery and fascination of Great Zimbabwe. Was the great enclosure primarily a royal palace, housing the king and his court? Or was it a major religious center, used for important ceremonies and rituals? Was the conical tower inside purely symbolic, Or did it have a practical function, perhaps related to astronomy or grain storage, though the latter seems unlikely given its shape? The hill complex was clearly a stronghold, but was it the primary residence of the king, or a sacred precinct, or both? The smaller enclosures in the valley suggest residential clusters, but who lived in them? Commoners, elites, craftspeople? The way the walls shape the space is also significant. They create a sense of order and definition in the landscape. They guide movement, enclose privacy, and elevate certain areas. Walking through the narrow, winding passages of the hill complex feels very different from standing in the vast, open space enclosed by the great enclosure wall. The architecture itself dictates how you experience the site, creating different atmospheres and potentially reinforcing social hierarchies or ceremonial routes. One mainstream historical fact about the walls is that the total length of all the stone walls at Great Zimbabwe, both major and minor, is estimated to be several miles. This gives you a sense of the sheer scale of the construction effort beyond just the most famous structures. It was a city crisscrossed and defined by stone. A quirky tidbit involves the sheer variety and the quality of the dry stonework across the site. While the outer faces of the major walls are incredibly well built, some of the internal walls or less prominent structures show slightly less precise fitting. It's almost like you can see the difference between the A-team builders working on the most important structures and perhaps less experienced teams, or a lower standard of work in less critical areas. It reminds you that this was a real city, built by real people with varying levels of skill, not some mythical, perfectly uniform creation. Historians still argue whether the different styles and quality of walling seen across Great Zimbabwe represent distinct phases of construction over time, with techniques evolving or changing, or if they primarily reflect the varied functions and importance of different structures within the city at any given time, with more effort and skill dedicated to key monumental areas. So, the builders of Great Zimbabwe didn't just master a single technique. They applied it with flexibility and ingenuity to create a diverse array of structures that served the very needs of a complex city. From the towering, imposing outer walls that defined the city's boundaries and projected its power, to the smaller enclosures that organized daily life, the dry stone technique was the language spoken by stone across the entire site. And within this language, there were even more sophisticated dialects, clever engineering tricks that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible with mortarless construction. And within this language, there were even more sophisticated dialects, clever engineering tricks that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible with mortarless construction. It's one thing to stack rocks into a straight wall, but to make them curve gracefully, to build them so they lean just so, to incorporate decorative patterns, that requires a level of skill and understanding that goes far beyond simple piling. You walk along the walls now, and you start to notice these details, subtle nods to the builder's mastery that might escape a casual glance. Take the famous curved wall of the great enclosure, for instance. Building a straight dry stone wall is challenging enough, but building a massive, freestanding wall in a near-perfect ellipse? How do you get those irregular, essentially straight-edged granite blocks to form such a smooth, continuous curve? It wasn't like they had CD software or laser guides. They had to rely on their eyes, their experience, and perhaps simple sighting lines or pegs and ropes to lay out the curve on the ground before starting the first course. Then, as they built upwards, they had to select and place each stone so that the overall line of the wall maintained that intended curve. This involves subtle adjustments, using slightly angled stones, or placing stones slightly proud or recessed to guide the line. It's like drawing a perfect circle freehand with a crayon made of rock, incredibly difficult, but they managed it on a monumental scale. The precision required to maintain that curve over hundreds of feet, layer upon layer, is genuinely astonishing. It speaks to a level of planning and execution that elevates this from simple construction to a sophisticated art form. Imagine being the foreman responsible for making sure the wall didn't end up looking like a slightly drunken wiggle instead of a majestic ellipse. The pressure. Then there's the batter, that intentional inward slope of the walls. We touched on it briefly when talking about foundations, but it's such a fundamental and clever trick that it deserves its own moment in the spotlight. Instead of building the wall straight up at a 90-degree angle to the ground, The builders angled it inward slightly as it rose. This isn't just aesthetic, it's pure physics. By leaning the wall inwards, they shifted its center of gravity towards the interior of the structure. This makes the wall inherently more stable and resistant to toppling outwards, which is the primary mode of failure for tall, thin walls. It's a simple principle, but incredibly effective, especially for a dry stone structure that relies solely on weight and friction for stability. It's the architectural equivalent of leaning back slightly when someone tries to push you over. You become much harder to budge. They knew, intuitively or through generations of trial and error, that a wall that leans is a wall that stands longer. Beyond these major structural elements, you see evidence of other clever techniques. Look closely at the top of some of the walls, particularly the main outer wall of the great enclosure. You'll see the chevron pattern, a decorative zigzag created by alternating the orientation of the stones in the upper courses. This wasn't necessary for structural integrity, but it adds a striking visual element. Creating this pattern with irregular stones, ensuring the lines are relatively straight and the points are consistent, required additional skill and planning. It shows that the builders weren't just focused on function, they also had an eye for aesthetics and symbolism. What did the chevron mean? We don't know for sure, but the effort put into it tells you it was important. Maybe it represented cattle horns, a symbol of wealth, or perhaps something else entirely. It's another layer of mystery etched in stone. Inside some of the thicker walls, particularly in the hill complex, archaeologists have found evidence of internal buttresses or changes in wall thickness designed to provide additional support in key areas, especially where the wall is particularly high or built on a steep slope. These internal features aren't visible from the outside, but they show a sophisticated understanding of how loads are distributed within the structure and where extra reinforcement is needed. It's like the hidden steel rebar in a modern concrete wall, only made of more strategically placed rocks. The builders also had to manage drainage. Water is the enemy of dry stone walls. While the lack of mortar allows water to pass through relatively easily, preventing hydrostatic pressure from building up, excessive water flow can still erode the ground around the base or wash away the essential infill within the walls. While not always obvious, there are signs that they considered how water would flow around and away from the structures, perhaps diverting runoff or ensuring foundations were laid on well-drained ground. How did they achieve such accuracy in laying stones and maintaining lines and levels without modern tools? They likely used simple, effective methods that have been employed by builders for millennia. Plumb bobs, for instance, a weight on a string, are a simple way to ensure a wall is vertical. Stretched ropes or lines could be used to guide the laying of courses and maintain straight lines or smooth curves. Wooden frames or temporary supports might have been used to help position heavy stones or guide the construction of upper layers before the weight of the stones locked everything into place. It's a reminder that complex engineering doesn't always require complex tools. Often, simple principles applied with skill and precision are enough. The scale of the project itself demanded sophisticated organization and planning. Building these structures wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. There would have been overseers, skilled masons directing teams of laborers, and a clear hierarchy to manage the flow of materials and the sequence of construction. The ability to coordinate hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers on a single project for extended periods is an engineering feat in itself, requiring logistical skills as impressive as the stonework. One mainstream historical fact that confirms the advanced nature of their engineering is the presence of these specific features like the battered walls and potentially internal reinforcing, which demonstrate a deliberate application of structural principles to ensure long-term stability, going beyond simple stacking. A quirky tidbit is that some researchers have speculated that the conical tower inside the great enclosure, while its exact function is debated, might have incorporated a slight lean or curve in its construction that is difficult to discern visually but contributes to its remarkable stability despite its height and lack of mortar. It's like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but intentional and successful. Historians still argue whether the sophisticated engineering techniques observed at Great Zimbabwe, such as the precise batter and curving, represent a continuous tradition of building knowledge passed down and refined over centuries within the Shona culture, or if there were periods of accelerated innovation or influence from external ideas. although the latter is less supported by evidence. So, the builders of Great Zimbabwe weren't just strong people who could lift heavy rocks. They were skilled engineers and architects who understood the properties of their materials, the forces of nature, and the principles of structural stability. They employed clever tricks like the battered profile, the interlocking courses, and perhaps even subtle internal supports to create structures that defied the limitations of mortarless construction and have stood as silent, powerful testaments to their ingenuity for over half a millennium. These walls weren't just barriers. They were carefully crafted statements of skill and power, integral to the life lived within the city. Shaping the very rhythm and purpose of existence for the thousands who called this place home. Stepping inside these walls isn't just about admiring the engineering, it's about trying to imagine the vibrant, complex world that thrived here for centuries. What was it like to wake up within the embrace of these stone giants? What sounds filled the air? What were the hopes and worries of the people who built and inhabited this remarkable place? Great Zimbabwe wasn't just a fortress, though its defensive aspects were clearly important, especially the hill complex. It wasn't just a ceremonial site, though it undoubtedly played a crucial role in the religious and political life of the kingdom. It was, first and foremost, a city, a bustling, dynamic capital that served multiple functions for a powerful state. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a national capital, a major economic hub, and a significant religious center all rolled into one, minus the traffic jams and endless bureaucracy, though maybe they had their own version of those. Life here was layered, reflecting the social hierarchy of the kingdom. At the top were the rulers and the elite, likely residing in the most prominent and well-protected areas, particularly the hill complex and perhaps the inner enclosures of the Great Enclosure. Imagine their lives, surrounded by towering stone walls, overseeing the kingdom's affairs, receiving tribute, perhaps participating in elaborate ceremonies. Their residences would have been larger, perhaps with more elaborate features, though the actual living structures within the stone enclosures were typically made of more perishable materials like mud and thatch, built on raised platforms or within stone-lined areas. You can still see the remnants of these platforms, circular outlines within the stone enclosures where huts once stood. It's a reminder that while the stone walls endure, the intimate spaces of daily life have largely returned to the earth. Down in the valley, within the vast perimeter of the Great Enclosure and in the surrounding valley settlements, lived the majority of the city's population. This included craftspeople, merchants, administrators, religious figures, and laborers, as well as people involved in supporting the agricultural and herding activities that fed the city. Imagine these areas filled with the sounds of daily life, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of voices in the marketplace, the lowing of cattle being guided into their stone kraals, the rustle of activity around storage huts. It would have been a hive of activity, a melting pot of skills and purposes. The purpose of the city was multifaceted. Politically, it was the seat of the monumental, or monumental, dynasty, the rulers of the powerful kingdom of Zimbabwe. From here, they administered their territory, which at its peak stretched across much of what is now Zimbabwe and parts of neighboring countries. Decisions were made here, authority was projected from these stone walls, and alliances were forged or broken. It was the beating heart of the state. Economically, Great Zimbabwe was a powerhouse, primarily thanks to its control over the gold trade. The city was strategically located relative to gold mines in the interior, and it served as the central collection and distribution point for gold and other valuable commodities like ivory, animal hides, and perhaps even copper. These goods were traded with merchants on the East African coast, bringing immense wealth into the kingdom in the form of imported luxuries. Imagine ships arriving on the coast laden with Chinese porcelain, Indian glass beads, Persian carpets, and bolts of cloth, all destined to be traded for the precious resources flowing out of Great Zimbabwe. This trade wasn't just about acquiring fancy foreign goods. It fueled the kingdom's economy, supported its elite, and provided the resources needed to undertake massive projects like building the stone city itself. It's a fascinating example of how a landlocked interior power could become incredibly wealthy by controlling access to valuable resources sought after on global trade networks. Religiously and culturally, Great Zimbabwe was also paramount. It was likely a center for religious practices, possibly involving the worship of ancestors or other deities. The Zimbabwe birds, those enigmatic soapstone carvings we mentioned earlier, are thought to have had significant religious or symbolic meaning, perhaps representing ancestral spirits, rulers, or important totems. Ceremonies and rituals would have taken place within the sacred enclosures, reinforcing the authority of the rulers and the cohesion of the community. The very act of building such a monumental city could also be seen as a form of cultural expression and religious devotion, a way of honoring the land, the ancestors, and the power of the kingdom. Imagine the sound of drums echoing off the stone walls during important festivals, a sound that would have filled the air with a sense of shared identity and purpose. Daily life for most inhabitants would have revolved around their specific roles within this complex system. Farmers would have worked the fields outside the city walls, bringing in crops to feed the population. Herders would have managed the vital cattle herds, probably keeping them in the stone kraals for protection. Craftspeople would have been busy making everything from pottery for storage and cooking to iron tools and weapons, woven textiles, and perhaps even carving those famous soapstone birds. Traders would have managed the flow of goods, both local and long distance, within the city's marketplaces. And laborers, of course, would have been constantly involved in maintaining the city, repairing structures, and in its heyday, continuing the monumental task of building and expanding the stone walls. It sounds exhausting, frankly, even without considering the African sun beating down. Makes you appreciate your climate-controlled office job, doesn't it? The architecture itself influenced daily life. The walls created distinct zones, separating different activities or social groups. The narrow passages in the hill complex might have served defensive purposes, but they also controlled movement and access, creating a sense of exclusivity for those within. The large, open enclosures could have been gathering places for public assemblies or ceremonies. The terraced areas provided usable space on the slopes, perhaps for housing or small gardens. The layout of the city wasn't random. It was designed to facilitate the functions of a complex society, guiding movement, organizing space, and reflecting the social order. One mainstream historical fact about life inside the city is that archaeological evidence, including numerous fragments of imported pottery and glass beads found during excavations, confirms Great Zimbabwe's role as a major trading center with connections to the Indian Ocean trade network, demonstrating the material wealth that flowed into the city. A quirky tidbit relates to the living arrangements within the stone enclosures. While the stone walls are what survive, the actual houses inside were typically circular huts made of daga, a mix of clay and gravel, with thatched roofs, built on raised daga platforms to protect against damp and provide a level floor. So, while you see the impressive stone walls today, imagine them with hundreds, maybe thousands, of these traditional huts nestled within and around them, a fascinating blend of monumental stone architecture and organic, perishable dwellings. Historians still argue whether the social structure within Great Zimbabwe was highly centralized and rigidly hierarchical, with the ruling elite exercising absolute control from the stone enclosures, or if there was a greater degree of autonomy and social mobility among different groups living within the city and its surrounding areas, with the stone structures primarily serving as symbols of power rather than instruments of total control. So, life within the walls of Great Zimbabwe was a complex tapestry woven from politics, economics, religion, and daily necessity. It was a world of skilled craftspeople, powerful rulers, bustling markets, and perhaps solemn rituals, all unfolding within the shadow of the incredible stone structures that defined the city. The purpose of this place wasn't just to exist. It was to thrive, to connect, and to project the power and ingenuity of the people who built it. But that power and ingenuity weren't just focused inwards, on building impressive walls and organizing daily life within the city. Great Zimbabwe was fundamentally outward-looking, a vital node in a vast network that stretched far beyond the granite copies, connecting the heart of southern Africa to the wider world. The stones might speak of local strength, but the artifacts found within them whisper tales of distant lands, of trade routes that crisscrossed continents, and of the wealth that flowed into the kingdom, fueling its growth and enabling the very construction you see today. You stand here, feeling the history soak into your skin, and you realize this wasn't an isolated kingdom hidden away from the world. It was a major player in a global, well, Afro-Eurasian at the time, economy. And the engine driving this connection was trade. Specifically, the trade in precious commodities that were highly sought after far beyond the borders of the kingdom. The most important of these was gold. The region surrounding Great Zimbabwe, particularly to the west and south, was rich in alluvial and reef gold deposits. The Shona ancestors, building on earlier traditions in the area, developed sophisticated techniques for prospecting, mining, and processing this gold. Imagine the scene: groups of miners, perhaps using simple tools like iron picks and shovels, digging shallow pits or following veins in the rock. It was painstaking, often dangerous work, extracting the glittering metal from the earth. Once extracted, the raw gold would be processed, perhaps crushed and washed to separate the gold dust, or melted and cast into ingots or other portable forms. This wasn't industrial-scale mining as we know it, but it was efficient enough to produce a significant surplus for trade. You can almost hear the scrape of tools against rock deep underground, the murmur of voices, the glint of gold dust caught in the sunlight. Beyond gold, another major export was ivory. Elephants were numerous in the region, and their tusks were highly valued on the coast and in markets further afield for carving and other uses. Hunting elephants required skill, bravery, and organization. It wasn't just about getting a tusk, it was about managing the hunt, processing the ivory, and transporting these heavy, valuable items. Other goods traded included animal hides, possibly copper from deposits further north, and perhaps even iron tools or agricultural products. These valuable resources, the gold and ivory, didn't just stay within the kingdom. They were the currency of connection, traveling along well-established trade routes to the Swahili city-states dotted along the East African coast, places like Kilwa, Sofala, and Mombasa. Imagine caravans, perhaps consisting of porters carrying heavy loads on their heads or backs, or potentially using pack animals in certain areas, traversing hundreds of miles through varying landscapes, facing the challenges of distance, terrain, and potential danger. It was a long, arduous journey, but the rewards at the end made it worthwhile. At the coastal ports, the merchants from Great Zimbabwe would meet with Swahili traders, who were themselves connected to a vast Indian Ocean trade network involving merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and even as far away as Southeast Asia and China. This is where the magic happened, the exchange. Gold and ivory from the African interior were traded for a dazzling array of imported goods. What did they get in return? Things they couldn't produce themselves, items that conferred prestige and signaled wealth and connection to the wider world. We're talking about fine ceramics, like Chinese porcelain with its delicate blue and white patterns, or stoneware from Persia and the Middle East. Imagine someone in 14th century Great Zimbabwe sipping from a porcelain cup made thousands of miles away. That's luxury. They also imported glass beads, often brightly colored and intricately patterned, which were highly valued as ornaments and possibly even as a form of currency or wealth storage. Cloth, particularly cotton and silk, would also have been traded, providing alternatives to local fibers. And perhaps other exotic goods like spices, perfumes, or even small metal objects. It's like the ultimate ancient Amazon order, but instead of waiting 2 days, you waited months or years, and instead of paying with a credit card, you paid with literal tons of gold. The flow of these imported goods into Great Zimbabwe is clearly visible in the archaeological record. Excavations within the ruins have uncovered thousands of fragments of foreign pottery and glass beads, particularly in areas associated with the ruling elite and wealthy merchants. This isn't just a few scattered pieces. It's enough to show that there was a significant and sustained influx of these items over centuries. This trade was absolutely central to the power and prosperity of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe and its capital city. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe controlled access to the source of the gold and ivory and controlled the routes by which they reached the coast. This allowed them to levy taxes on the trade, accumulate vast personal wealth, and maintain a monopoly on the most valuable imported goods. This economic power translated directly into political authority. It allowed the rulers to reward loyal followers, fund military activities if needed, and crucially, mobilize and support the large labor force required to quarry, transport, and build the massive stone structures of the city. Without the wealth generated by this long-distance trade, it's highly unlikely that Great Zimbabwe could have reached the scale and complexity that it did. The stones were local, but the ability to build with them on this scale was funded by global connections. One mainstream historical fact that confirms the extent of this trade is the discovery of large quantities of imported artifacts at Great Zimbabwe, including significant amounts of Chinese Celadon pottery dating from the Song and Yuan dynasties, 11th to 14th centuries CE, and Persian faience, providing concrete evidence of long-distance trade links. A quirky tidbit related to this trade is the sheer volume of glass beads found at the site. Some archaeological layers contained thousands of beads, suggesting they weren't just rare trinkets for the elite but were perhaps used more widely, possibly even for decorating clothing or as part of religious rituals, showing how imported goods were integrated into daily and ceremonial life. Imagine having a dress adorned with thousands of tiny imported glass beads. Definitely a fashion statement that would turn heads today, let alone centuries ago. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the construction of the monumental stone walls at Great Zimbabwe was to protect the wealth generated by the gold trade, or if the trade itself was a consequence of an already powerful state that could organize the extraction and control the routes, using the wealth primarily for prestige and internal consolidation of power. So, Great Zimbabwe was far more than just an impressive collection of stone walls. It was the vibrant, wealthy capital of a kingdom that successfully leveraged its natural resources and strategic location to become a key player in the Indian Ocean trade network. The gold and ivory that flowed out of the interior brought back a stream of luxury goods that enriched the elite, fueled the economy, and provided the resources necessary to transform a landscape of granite copies into one of the most remarkable cities in ancient Africa. This period of prosperity and power, however, was not destined to last forever. Standing here, surrounded by the silent stones, it's easy to feel a sense of permanence, to imagine this city thriving indefinitely. But like all great civilizations and bustling metropolises throughout history, Great Zimbabwe eventually faced challenges it couldn't overcome, leading to its decline and eventual abandonment sometime in the mid-15th century. The reasons aren't a single, simple answer etched into the stones. They are a complex web of environmental, economic, and political factors, debated by historians and archaeologists to this day. It's like trying to figure out why your favorite band broke up. Was it creative differences, money problems, or just that one guy who always wanted to play the kazoo solo? Probably a mix. One of the most widely accepted theories centers around environmental degradation. Remember how we talked about the fertile valleys and the need to feed a population estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 people? Sustaining a city of that size, along with its surrounding communities and vast cattle herds, put immense pressure on the local environment. Over centuries, intensive agriculture could have led to soil exhaustion, reducing crop yields. The demand for wood, for fuel, building huts, and perhaps even for smelting metals, would have resulted in deforestation in the immediate vicinity, requiring people to travel further and further to find resources. Imagine having to hike miles just to get firewood. It adds a whole new level of difficulty to dinner prep. Overgrazing by the kingdom's substantial cattle herds could have also contributed to environmental problems, leading to soil erosion and further reducing the carrying capacity of the land. As the environment around the city became less able to support the population and livestock, it would have put increasing strain on the kingdom's ability to feed itself and maintain its prosperity. It's a classic case of a growing population eventually outstripping the ability of the local environment to sustain it, a story that has played out in many places throughout history. Another significant factor likely involved changes in the trade networks that were so crucial to Great Zimbabwe's wealth. Remember the gold and ivory flowing to the East African coast? While Great Zimbabwe controlled access to these resources for a long time, trade routes weren't static. New sources of gold might have been discovered further north or south, diverting trade away from Great Zimbabwe's control. Alternatively, changes in the political landscape on the coast or in the wider Indian Ocean world could have disrupted the demand for the interior goods or shifted the focus of trade to different commodities or different coastal ports. If the coastal customers decided they suddenly didn't want as much gold, or found a new supplier, Great Zimbabwe's economic engine would sputter. It's like your main customer deciding to switch to your competitor. Suddenly, things get tough. There is also evidence that the gold resources themselves might have become depleted in the areas most easily accessible to Great Zimbabwe. While other gold-bearing regions existed, perhaps those closest to the city were worked out after centuries of mining, requiring the kingdom to seek resources further afield, increasing the cost and difficulty of extraction and transportation. Internal political factors also likely played a role. As kingdoms grow and become wealthy, they can also become prone to internal strife, succession disputes, or the rise of competing power centers. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe might have experienced internal divisions or challenges to the authority of the ruling dynasty centered at Great Zimbabwe. Perhaps ambitious provincial leaders gained enough wealth and influence to challenge the capital's dominance. Oral traditions and later historical accounts of successor states like the Matapa Kingdom, which rose to prominence further north around the time of Great Zimbabwe's decline, and the Torwa Kingdom, which emerged to the southwest, suggest a shift in political power away from Great Zimbabwe. It's possible that the ruling elite, facing environmental stress and economic challenges, lost their grip on power, leading to fragmentation and the eventual abandonment of the capital. Maybe the kazoo player started his own band and took half the fans with him. Disease outbreaks could also have played a part, though direct archaeological evidence for this is often hard to find. Concentrated urban populations are more susceptible to the spread of infectious diseases. A major epidemic could have significantly reduced the population, disrupted labor, and weakened the kingdom. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe wasn't necessarily a sudden, catastrophic event. It was likely a gradual process, possibly unfolding over several decades. As environmental conditions worsened, trade routes shifted, or political power waned, the advantages of living in such a large, centralized city might have diminished. People, perhaps led by dissenting elites or simply seeking better opportunities, may have gradually migrated away from the capital, moving to areas with more fertile land, closer to new trade routes, or under the authority of rising political centers. The monumental stone structures were left behind, silent and empty, as the heart of the kingdom shifted elsewhere. The decline of Great Zimbabwe didn't mean the end of stone building or the Shona cultural tradition in the region. The successor states, the Matapa and Torwa kingdoms, also built stone structures, though often in different styles and scales, at sites like Kami and Danimam. This shows a continuity of skill and tradition, but a change in the political and economic landscape that no longer supported a capital on the scale of Great Zimbabwe at this specific location. One mainstream historical fact supporting the decline theory is the archaeological dating of the peak occupation and construction at Great Zimbabwe to roughly the 14th and early 15th centuries, with evidence of significant decline and abandonment by the mid-15th century, coinciding with the rise of other regional powers and shifts in trade patterns. A quirky tidbit? Some fringe theories, often linked to the earlier colonial myths about foreign builders, suggested that the city was abandoned because the foreign builders left. This, of course, is completely unsupported by evidence and ignores the environmental and economic factors that actually drove the decline of the Shona kingdom centered there. It's another example of how determined some people were to ignore the obvious truth. Historians still argue whether environmental factors, like soil exhaustion and deforestation, were the primary drivers of the decline, making the city unsustainable, or if economic factors, like the shift in gold trade routes, were more significant, undermining the kingdom's wealth and the ruling elite's ability to maintain the capital. It was almost certainly a combination, but the exact interplay and weighting of these factors remain subjects of ongoing research and debate. So, the towering walls of Great Zimbabwe, built with such incredible ingenuity and effort, eventually stood witness to the city's slow decline. Environmental pressures, shifting trade dynamics, and potentially internal political changes combined to make this once thriving capital less viable. The people who built it, the ancestors of the Shona didn't vanish. They moved, adapted, and continued their traditions in other locations, leaving behind their magnificent stone city as a testament to their past power and ingenuity, waiting to be rediscovered. Waiting to be rediscovered, standing silent and empty under the vast African sky for centuries. The kingdom that built it had moved on, leaving behind a monumental legacy in stone that time and nature slowly began to reclaim. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, the sun beat down, the rains fell, and the granite copies watched over their silent child. For generations, local people, the descendants of the builders, knew of the ruins, respected them, and carried their oral traditions about the great city and its rulers. But to the outside world, particularly the European world, Great Zimbabwe remained largely unknown, a mystery waiting in the interior. Then, in the late 19th century, as European explorers, missionaries, hunters, and fortune-seekers pushed further into the African interior, they stumbled upon these incredible ruins. Imagine the scene: pioneers expecting simple villages suddenly confronting towering stone walls, massive enclosures, and a conical tower rising from the plains. Their reaction, sadly, was often one of disbelief and prejudice. Figures like Karl Marx, the German geologist, were so astonished, and so steeped in the racist ideologies of the time that they simply could not accept that such sophisticated architecture could have been created by the ancestors of the local African people they encountered. We touched on this before, remember? That frankly hilarious, if tragic, lack of imagination where they'd rather invent Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba than credit the actual inhabitants of the land. It's like finding a masterpiece painting in someone's living room and insisting it must have been left there by aliens because, clearly, the person living there couldn't possibly be an artist. Utter nonsense, of course. This colonial mindset led to decades of harmful speculation and, worse, destructive treasure hunting. Convinced that the ruins were built by some ancient, wealthy foreign civilization, adventurers literally dug into the walls and structures, causing significant damage, searching for mythical gold hoards or artifacts that would support their wild theories. It's a grim reminder of how prejudice can lead not just to twisted narratives, but to the physical destruction of history. They were so determined to be wrong, they actively dismantled the evidence of their wrongness. Truly mind-boggling. Fortunately, this period of willful ignorance and destruction didn't last forever. As the 20th century progressed, serious archaeological work began at Great Zimbabwe. Archaeologists, often working against the prevailing colonial biases, started to meticulously excavate the site, analyze the artifacts they found, and compare the building techniques to those of other cultures in the region. And the evidence, layer by layer, artifact by artifact, pointed unequivocally to the ancestors of the Shona people as the builders and inhabitants. The pottery found within the ruins, the iron tools, the remnants of daga huts built on stone platforms, the unique Zimbabwe birds, all of it connected directly to the material culture and traditions of the people who lived in this region for centuries, including the ancestors of the modern Shona. There was no sudden layer of foreign artifacts that would suggest a different population built the main structures. The story told by the earth and the stones themselves was clear. This was an indigenous African civilization, a powerful Shona kingdom that flourished here long before Europeans arrived on the scene. Debunking the myths was a long and necessary process, not just for historical accuracy, but for acknowledging the incredible achievements of African societies. Great Zimbabwe stands as a powerful counterpoint to the colonial narrative that often depicted pre-colonial Africa as lacking complex societies or sophisticated technology. It is undeniable proof of a powerful, wealthy, and highly organized state capable of monumental construction and participation in global trade networks. It's a testament to African ingenuity and skill, built by Africans for Africans. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a site of immense importance, both globally and nationally. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its outstanding universal value as a unique cultural property. This status helps protect the ruins from further damage and ensures they are preserved for future generations. It is also a source of immense pride for the people of Zimbabwe, serving as a potent national symbol. The name of the country itself, Zimbabwe, is derived from the Shona term Zimba Zamabwe, meaning houses of stone. or venerated houses, directly referencing the ruins. The Zimbabwe bird, that quirky soapstone carving, is featured on the national flag and currency. The site is not just a collection of old rocks. It is woven into the very fabric of the nation's identity, a tangible link to a powerful and prosperous past. Visiting Great Zimbabwe today is a powerful experience. You walk among the walls, touch the stones, and feel the weight of history, but now, you do so with the knowledge of who built it and why. The mystery isn't about who anymore, but about the incredible how. How did they achieve such scale and precision with simple tools and no mortar? And the enduring why? Why did this powerful kingdom eventually decline? These questions continue to fascinate archaeologists and historians, driving ongoing research and adding layers to our understanding. One mainstream historical fact about the site's modern importance is its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, recognizing its significance as one of the most important archaeological sites in sub-Saharan Africa and a symbol of the cultural heritage of the Shona people. A quirky tidbit is that despite the extensive archaeological work, new discoveries are still being made at Great Zimbabwe, sometimes as simple as finding previously unnoticed sections of wall hidden by vegetation or uncovering new clusters of artifacts that shed light on specific aspects of daily life or trade. The stones still hold secrets, waiting for patient eyes to find them. Historians still argue whether the post-abandonment history of the site involved any significant reoccupation or continued ceremonial use by local communities after the decline of the main kingdom, or if it was largely left uninhabited, becoming solely a site of historical memory and reverence. So, the journey through the dry stone walls of Great Zimbabwe brings us full circle. From the initial mystery and colonial denial, through the painstaking process of archaeological discovery and debunking myths, we arrive at a place of understanding and profound respect for the ingenuity and legacy of the Shona ancestors. These aren't just ruins, they are a library of stone, telling a story of power, trade, skill, and adaptation, a story that continues to resonate today. As the sun begins to set over the granite copies, casting long shadows that stretch across the valley floor, painting the ancient stones in hues of orange and purple, you feel the day's journey winding down. The air grows cooler now, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke, a smell that might not be so different from the evenings here centuries ago. Your mind is full of images, massive stones being levered from the earth, teams of builders fitting irregular blocks with impossible precision, caravans loaded with gold heading towards the coast, the lowing of cattle within stone kraals, the echo of drums from the hill complex. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? The sheer scale, the human effort, the rise and fall of a powerful kingdom etched into the landscape. But now, the hard thinking is done. The questions about how they did it, who they were, and why the city eventually fell have been explored, leaving you with a deeper appreciation for this incredible place and the people who built it. As you settle down, letting the sounds of the night take over, the silent stones of Great Zimbabwe stand watch, their story now a quiet whisper in your mind. You can let the weight of the day, and the weight of all that ancient stone, gently fade away. Just breathe slowly, feel yourself sink into your bed, and let the images drift like clouds across your consciousness. The journey through history is over for tonight. Rest now.